Starting out in the 18th century, we find the first cases of capital punishment. Captain George Kendall was the first man to be lawfully executed in the colonies. Kendall was tried and condemned to death by firing squad in 1608 for being a spy and mutineer, the first in a stream of lawful murders. 4 years later, in 1612, the Virginian governor enacted the first official death penalty laws, entitled the Divine, Moral, and Martial Laws, in which any person may be executed for crimes such as stealing grapes, killing chickens, and trading with Indians. Part of the abstract reasons for the death penalty might come from Britain, where there were 222 punishable crimes by method of death. Things like stealing, cutting down a tree, writing a threatening letter, and damaging a bridge could get a rope around your neck until the 1800s, where over 100 of these crimes were eliminated. Jane Champion was the first woman to be executed in the colonies in 1632, although the reason is debated. In 1791, as the Bill of Rights was established, the Eighth Amendment was ratified. This prohibited the use of cruel and unusual punishments, leading to debate, even today, on what entails for capital punishment, although most believe it was not meant to stop the death penalty. Now, into the 1800s, was the first surge of penitentiaries and legal reforms by states in the colonies, which began to separate methods of execution and, for what reasons, by state. In 1834, Pennsylvania moved capital punishment to their state penitentiary, followed by other states with the idea of localized capital punishment being mostly terminated. Michigan became the first state to abolish all reasons for capital punishment except for treason in 1846. Then, 2 years later, in 1848, a man named William Kemmler killed his wife with an axe and became the first man executed by electric chair in New York at age 30. Almost all states that used the death penalty had begun to transfer the method of killing from hanging to electrocution by 1913. Between 1907 to 1917, 9 states had more or less abolished capital punishment. After World War I saw the effectiveness of lethal gas in 1924, Nevada adopted capital punishment by way of lethal gas and was first used on Guy John for murder, who was 29 when he was sentenced to death. By the 1930s, executions had reached 167 people per year, and ultimately reached 199 in 1 year in 1935. By the 50s and 60s, 13 states had completely abolished the death penalty. In 1952, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg became the first U.S. citizens executed for espionage by reason of selling atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. Furman v. Georgia was decided on June 29, 1972, by the Supreme Court of Georgia, that the death penalty violated the Eighth Amendment, which officially ended the death penalty in Georgia. 14 years later, in 1986, was Ford v. Wainwright. This case involved a man convicted who was pronounced mentally incompetent sometime after being detained, which raised a question. Could he still face capital punishment? The answer, ultimately, was no, and the execution of any person who was pronounced insane or otherwise mentally incapable was pronounced illegal. 13 years later, in 1988, Thompson v. Oklahoma, it was decided that any person who committed a crime at age 15 or younger could not be executed. In 1992, the Church released the first universal catechism on the Catholic faith after more than 4 centuries, but in 1997, a second edition was also released that further emphasized the Church's stance on the death penalty. In the year 2000, DNA testing became widely popular and cleared many people for crimes they never committed. But it came much too late for prisoners like Frank Lee Smith, who died on death row after spending 15 years in prison and cleared for the case after his death. Currently, the number of executions in the United States is recorded to be 15,981 since the year 1608, with 10,524 of them taking place between the years 1850 to 1949. In other words, in 100 years, over 10,500 people lost their lives solely to capital punishment. 15 out of 27 states use only lethal injection, with every other listing it as the primary execution method. It is the primary method of execution in every state that still carries out capital punishment. According to U.S. legislation, doctors are unable to participate in executions. However, a doctor will certify the inmate is dead. This lack of medical participation can be disastrous because often injections are performed by inexperienced people. As of only 2014, lethal injection executions had the second highest recorded amount of use and also the highest botch rate. According to Gruesome Spectacles, Botched Executions and America's Death Penalty by Austin Surratt, a book that contains data compiled over 30 years, over 7% of executions done by lethal injection were botched at a total of 75 people in just a 30-year period. Almost all of these were due to blatant incompetence or horrifically painful, unnatural reactions to the drugs. On April 29, 2014, after a complete embarrassment of an execution, Clayton D. Lockett was brutally murdered, and it took them over 45 minutes. For some background, around this time, the United States was having some problems with the main anesthetic used for executions. Hospira, their primary and only drug administrator for sodium thiopentanol, which was the anesthetic of choice, had found contamination in their drugs and stopped all production. This led states across the U.S. to scramble for alternatives in different countries, swiftly failing for the most part. So they developed midazolam, which had never been used for an execution and was being planned for use on Clayton D. Lockett and another inmate. Lockett was never unconscious, though, and struggled with every bit of energy he had to escape the gurney and speak once the potassium chloride, or killer drug, was injected. He struggled and writhed for 10 minutes with a heartbeat of 20 beats per second instead of the normal 60 to 100. He was struggling to breathe, he moaned in pain, and died after about 15 minutes. The electric chair has left 84 botched executions in those same 30 years with a 2% botch rate. Almost every time it fails, the chair is faulty, the prisoner starts to bleed across his neck and chest and catches fire. Usually this involves more than one round of the 30-second 2,000-volt electrocution. This is a paraphrasing of the story of John Louis Evans's execution in 1983 as remembered by Russell F. Keenan, a judge present at the scene. The first jolt of 1900 volts of electricity passed through Mr. Evans's body. It lasted 30 seconds. Sparks and flames erupted from the electrode tied to Mr. Evans's left leg. A large puff of grayish smoke and sparks poured out from under the hood that covered Mr. Evans's face. An overpowering stench of burnt flesh and clothing began pervading the witness room. 2 doctors examined Mr. Evans and declared that he was not dead. Mr. Evans was administered a second 30-second jolt of electricity. Again, the doctors examined Mr. Evans. The doctor reported that his heart was still beating and that he was still alive. At that time, I asked the prisoner commissioner, who was communicating on an open telephone line to Governor George Wallace, to grant clemency on the grounds that Mr. Evans was being subjected to cruel and unusual punishment. The request for clemency was denied. A third charge of electricity, 30 seconds in duration, was passed through Mr. Evans's body. At 8:44, the doctors pronounced him dead. The execution of John Evans took 14 minutes. Officially, the Church, especially the Pope, has been very emphatic about the abolition of the death penalty. There can be no stepping back from this position. Today, we state clearly that the death penalty is inadmissible, and the Church is firmly committed to calling for its abolition worldwide. Pope Francis. Pope Francis has also stated, "I would link this to life imprisonment. A life sentence is a secret death penalty," and has made strides to improve prison conditions. So, the Church has made it abundantly clear that not only is it one of our duties to visit those in prison, but life imprisonment and the death penalty violate the dignity of the human person. To deprive a human being of their life is not up to us, at least as far as the Church is concerned. Capital punishment violates the ethical values of the Eighth Amendment because of the cruel ways many prisoners have been executed and will continue to be. It also violates the teachings of the Catholic Church on the life and dignity of the human person. Past it being more or less illegal and against the Church teaching, logically and morally it seems it would be much more appropriate to actually reform the prisoner. Life imprisonment will not restore a family member, and neither will the murderer's death. So if the murderer could actually be reformed and monitored, at least some good could come out of it. Either way, it is morally invalid to use or enforce capital punishment. When a court decides on death, they become the murderers themselves.